There comes a moment when the atmosphere around you tightens in a way you cannot explain. A moment when your spirit senses danger long before your mind understands the threat. And for anyone who has ever dealt with a narcissist, that moment becomes the turning point of an entire life. It begins with small signs, things so quiet that only a spiritually sensitive heart can feel them. A strange discomfort during conversations, a sudden heaviness after simple interactions, a feeling that the person standing in front of you is no longer the person you once hoped they could become. And slowly, without warning, the truth begins to rise to the surface. For a long time you tolerated more than anyone should ever have to tolerate. You forgave lies that were told with confidence. You accepted apologies that were never sincere. You carried burdens that were deliberately placed on your shoulders by someone who saw your kindness as an opportunity. You explained your feelings to someone who never intended to listen. You compromised with someone who only valued your sacrifice, not your heart. You protected someone who had no intention of protecting you. And during all of this, you wondered why your prayers sounded unanswered. You questioned why your peace disappeared the moment you stepped into their presence. You wondered why the harder you tried to make things work, the more everything collapsed. And somewhere deep inside, your spirit started to whisper that something was wrong, that something was off, that something was spiritually unsafe. You tried to dismiss it. You tried to rationalize it. You tried to convince yourself that maybe you were being too emotional, too sensitive, too forgiving, too hopeful, but the discomfort kept growing. The tension kept rising, the peace kept fading, until eventually the truth became unavoidable. Narcissists live off spiritual confusion. They grow strong in environments where you doubt yourself. They thrive in places where you feel responsible for their pain, their anger, their chaos. They depend on guilt to keep you silent. They depend on hope to keep you in place. They depend on your patience to extend their control. But when God enters the situation, every tool they used begins to fail. One day, something inside you shifted. It did not happen with shouting. It did not happen during an argument. It did not happen in a dramatic moment. It happened quietly, silently, almost softly. Like the gentle closing of a chapter you did not even realize was ready to end. You woke up and something felt different. The emotional grip they once had over you loosened. The fear they planted lost its strength. The confusion they caused no longer made sense. The guilt they used stopped working. The charm they tried to resurrect fell flat. It was as if heaven reached into your heart and unplugged the attachment that once held you captive. And when that shift happened, their power broke in an instant. Because narcissistic control cannot survive spiritual clarity. It cannot survive when your eyes finally open. It cannot survive when your heart stops responding to their performance. It cannot survive when God interrupts the cycle. You began to see things you were blind to before. You saw the patterns, you saw the manipulation, you saw the way they twisted every situation so they could remain the victim. You saw the selfishness that hid behind their kindness. You saw the lies they spoke with confidence. You saw how they thrived when you were tired, and how they panicked when you regained strength. And you realized something painful but necessary. God was not trying to fix the relationship. God was trying to free you from it. That realization became the turning point of your spiritual journey, because the moment you accepted that truth, even if your heart was still hurting, even if your mind was still confused, even if your memories were still soft, heaven moved. The moment you whispered, "Lord, if this is not your will, remove it," everything began to shift in the unseen realm. You may not have noticed it right away, but God had already begun dismantling the foundation the narcissist built. He weakened their emotional influence. He disrupted their control. He exposed their tactics. He restored your discernment. He strengthened your boundaries. He reawakened the strength they worked so hard to keep buried. And while you were being lifted, they were being confined. Narcissists do not enter physical prisons. They enter spiritual ones. When they lose control over the person they used to drain, they lose the identity they built. Their confidence collapses. Their ego begins to starve. Their mask starts to crumble. Their arrogance becomes fear. Their certainty becomes doubt. Their power becomes weakness. Because a narcissist without control is a narcissist without purpose. And your freedom became the very thing that exposed them. Your healing revealed the emptiness inside them. Your clarity revealed the lies they lived by. Your obedience revealed their rebellion. When you accepted God's will, you stepped out of something that had been draining you for far too long. But the narcissist stepped into something far worse, the consequences of their own actions. Because without your energy, without your presence, without your compassion, without your emotional strength, they are forced to face themselves. And nothing terrifies a narcissist more than their own reflection. And if you think the shift you feel right now is powerful, wait until you see what happens when heaven finishes the work that has already begun. There comes a moment when the walls a narcissist built to protect their ego begin to shake, and the first cracks appear, not in the world around them, but inside the identity they crafted to survive. When you stepped out of their grasp, they did not simply lose a person, they lost the anchor that held their false self together. Narcissists survive by reflection. They survive by projection. They survive by attaching themselves to the strength of others so they can avoid confronting the weakness within themselves. And the moment a person they depended on awakens spiritually, the entire system they used to feel powerful begins to collapse. This collapse does not happen instantly, and it does not happen quietly. It begins in the smallest corners of their life, showing up as irritation they cannot explain, restlessness they cannot calm, and anger that seems to come out of nowhere. They become frustrated when old manipulation tactics no longer work. They become panicked when silence no longer intimidates you. They become confused when you no longer respond to their accusations, their guilt, or their emotional outbursts. And slowly, without warning, they begin to lose control of the narrative they once shaped so easily. Narcissists rely on predictability. They rely on cycles. They rely on knowing exactly which button to press to get the reaction they want. But the moment God lifts a person out of confusion, those buttons stop working. The cycle breaks. The pattern ends. The power shifts, and the narcissist finds themselves face to face with a reality they never prepared for. A version of you that no longer bends, no longer explains, no longer absorbs their chaos, and no longer carries the blame they placed on your shoulder. When a narcissist realizes they lost control, the panic is immediate. They replay interactions in their mind, searching for the moment you changed, the moment you detached, the moment you saw through the mask they spent years perfecting. They examine your silence like it is a threat. They treat your distance like an insult. They interpret your healing as betrayal. And the more they notice you rising, the more they feel themselves falling. Because narcissists believe they cannot lose. They believe they cannot be wrong. They believe they cannot be abandoned. Their entire identity is built on the illusion of superiority, and the moment that illusion breaks, they begin to crumble. They will try to regain control the only way they know how, by creating confusion. They may attempt sudden kindness, hoping you will forget the pain. They may start false apologies, hoping you will lower your guard. They may use pity, hoping you will feel responsible. They may twist stories, hoping you will doubt your memories. But none of it works once clarity enters your spirit. Heaven does not allow confusion to take root once truth has been revealed, and the narcissist senses this. The invisible barrier around you, the protection you carry, the strength returning to your voice, the peace settling into your spirit, the confidence rising in your decisions. They feel it even before you recognize it. They sense the spiritual shield around you. They feel the loss of access. They notice the silence of heaven where their manipulation used to echo. And this realization pushes them into the first stage of their spiritual prison, exposure. Exposure does not always happen publicly. It often begins privately, in the quiet darkness of their mind, where they can no longer lie to themselves. They feel empty, but cannot explain it. They feel restless, but cannot soothe it. They feel threatened, but cannot identify why. They feel weak, but cannot admit it. And the reason is simple. The supply that kept them alive has been cut off. Without your emotional support, their ego begins to starve. Without your attention, their identity begins to fade. Without your forgiveness, their confidence begins to collapse. Without your presence, their world begins to shrink. Their charm no longer works. Their excuses no longer hold power. Their anger no longer commands fear. Their manipulation no longer creates confusion. They find themselves pacing mentally, looking for a new source of control, but every attempt fails because God has closed the doors they used to walk through easily. When heaven cuts access, no amount of charm, guilt, or deception can reopen it. This is when the second stage of their collapse begins: consequences. Narcissists are not accustomed to consequences. They spend years escaping accountability, blaming others, shifting responsibility, rewriting history, and presenting themselves as the victim. But God does not allow injustice to remain unaddressed forever. When a chosen heart is harmed, heaven keeps record. Every lie told, every manipulation hidden, every wound inflicted, every betrayal repeated, none of it is forgotten. And when the season of exposure arrives, consequences follow quickly. They begin losing relationships they once relied on. People around them start noticing patterns they ignored before. Their charm weakens, their credibility shrinks, their opportunities dry up, their reputation becomes unstable, their confidence turns into paranoia, their arrogance turns into fear, and while they spiral, you rise. While they drown in confusion, you find clarity. While they unravel, you heal. While they lose what they built through deception, you gain what God planned for you all along. This imbalance terrifies them, because narcissists believe they should always come out on top. They expect to remain the center. They expect to remain admired. They expect to remain powerful. But God has removed the shield that once protected their ego, and now every action produces consequences they cannot escape. And as their world tightens around them, as their mask grows heavier, as their control slips further away, they begin to sense a truth they never wanted to face. The battle they lost was not with you, it was with the will of heaven itself. And if you think the consequences they are facing now are severe, wait until you see the moment when everything they tried to hide finally comes to light. There comes a moment when a narcissist realizes that the consequences they are facing are no longer temporary setbacks, but the beginning of a long unraveling that cannot be stopped, reversed, or escaped. And that realization hits them harder than any confrontation ever could. It begins when they see life moving forward without them, when they notice that the person who once carried their emotional weight is now walking freely, breathing deeply, and reclaiming the peace they worked so hard to destroy. Nothing frightens a narcissist more than witnessing the restoration of someone they believed they had broken permanently. They watch from a distance. Even if they pretend not to care, they observe in silence while acting like you were easily replaced. They study you because they need to understand how you healed without their permission, how you rose without their support, and how you found strength in a place they never expected you to find it. And as your life begins to stabilize, their life begins to fracture. This fracture is not random, it follows a pattern, a spiritual sequence that exposes everything built on deception. It starts with loss of influence. People who once admired them begin to see inconsistencies. Friends start questioning stories. Co-workers notice patterns. Family members observe the same behaviors you once tried to explain. Their charm stops working on the people they used to manipulate easily. Their confidence begins to look like arrogance. Their jokes sound forced. Their excuses sound repetitive. Their mask, once nearly flawless, begins to slip in moments they cannot control. And narcissists do not handle exposure well. Exposure forces them to acknowledge the one truth they spend their lives avoiding. They are not the person they pretend to be. The second fracture appears in their relationships. They begin losing connections they once depended on to feed their ego. People withdraw from them emotionally. Conversations become shorter, invitations become fewer, trust becomes fragile. Their circle tightens, not because they want it to, but because the false image they built can no longer hold its shape. Every narcissist believes they can replace you easily, but what they discover after losing someone spiritually awakened is that you were never replaceable. You were the stabilizer. You were the emotional anchor. You were the mirror that made them feel valuable. You were the one who brought compassion into their world. And when you left, everything they tried to build on your strength collapsed under the weight of their emptiness. The third fracture comes when their routine loses structure. They struggle with focus, they become impulsive, they make decisions fueled by panic instead of logic. The careful image they curated begins to show cracks through inconsistent behavior. They overreact to small things. They misinterpret neutral comments as attacks. Their emotions swing without control because they have lost the supply that once regulated their instability. And in this chaos, they begin to feel something they rarely feel: the truth. They feel the emptiness you once protected them from. They feel the loneliness you once filled. They feel the guilt they once placed on your shoulders. They feel the consequences of behaviors they once blamed on you. For the first time, they must sit with themselves, and that is the one place they never wanted to be. The fourth fracture comes from spiritual discomfort. Even though narcissists do not acknowledge accountability, they sense when judgment enters their life. They feel a heaviness they cannot explain. Doors they expected to open begin to close. Opportunities that came easily begin to disappear. Plans fail unexpectedly. Their confidence weakens. Their intuition becomes clouded. They experience isolation that cannot be solved by attention, admiration, or new relationships. This spiritual pressure intensifies with each passing day, pushing them further into a state they cannot control: self-exposure. Self-exposure is when their true character becomes visible even to themselves. They begin recognizing the patterns they used to deny. They see the same manipulation they blamed on others. They feel the same insecurities they projected onto you. They realize that every relationship fails for the same reason, not because people betray them, but because they sabotage anything they cannot control. And this truth haunts them. But the deepest fracture of all comes when they realize something far more devastating. The freedom you gained is not temporary. Narcissists expect people to return. They expect emotional dependence to resurface. They expect confusion to weaken your boundaries. They expect guilt to pull you back. They expect fear to make you reconsider. They expect silence to make you vulnerable. But when God heals a heart, it does not return to what broke it. When God restores a mind, it does not forget the revelation. When God frees a soul, it does not walk back into captivity. This is the truth that devastates them. You have outgrown the version of yourself they could control. You have stepped into spiritual awareness they cannot manipulate. You have found peace they cannot disturb. You have entered a season of alignment where God becomes the center, not their approval. And as you rise, the narcissist becomes increasingly frantic. They may attempt to observe your life from the outside, hoping for signs of struggle. They may try to reach through mutual connections. They may attempt to draw sympathy from people who do not know the truth, but nothing they do restores the power they lost, because the source of that power was never them. It was your willingness to carry emotional weight that was never yours. And once that willingness disappears, their influence disappears with it. What they face now is only the beginning, because consequences do not stop at discomfort. Exposure does not stop at panic. Judgment does not stop at restlessness. The next stage brings something far more revealing, far more powerful, and far more unavoidable, a collapse that forces them to face the one reality they spent years hiding from. There comes a moment when a narcissist reaches the edge of their own unraveling, a moment when the life they constructed through deception, charm, and manipulation can no longer hold its shape, and that moment arrives faster and hits harder after losing the person they believed would always absorb the damage. The collapse begins quietly, but the effects are anything but quiet. It starts with instability in the places they thought were secure. Work becomes stressful. Relationships grow tense. Their temper shortens. Small inconveniences feel like personal attacks. They begin to sense that something is slipping out of their control, something they cannot explain, something they cannot manipulate back into place. At first, they blame circumstances, they blame people, they blame timing, they blame anyone except themselves. But the truth keeps tightening its grip around them, reminding them that the chaos they face now is the same chaos they once planted in the lives of others. This is the point where heaven begins to shift the spiritual balance completely. You were once the emotional cushion that softened their consequences, the voice that calmed their storms, the presence that disguised their instability. Without you, their life loses the stability you unknowingly provided, and the structure they built on your strength begins to crumble under the weakness they tried to hide. The first wave of their collapse hits their relationships. They become easily irritated, overly defensive, and suspicious of everyone around them. They accuse others of betrayal. They interpret neutral actions as disrespect. They try to control conversations. They attempt to dominate decisions. But the more they try to tighten their grip, the faster people slip away. Friends distance themselves. Co-workers keep interactions brief. Family members grow tired of the drama. Their usual charm falls flat because charm requires emotional energy they no longer possess. Their mask, once polished and convincing, now cracks under the weight of exhaustion, and people begin to see through them in ways the narcissist cannot stop. The second wave hits their confidence. Narcissists depend heavily on external validation to feel stable. They need admiration to feel important. They need attention to feel alive. They need control to feel safe. But when your presence is gone, the praise they used to receive feels shallow, the attention they used to attract feels temporary, and the control they once had feels unstable. They start comparing themselves to others. They feel threatened by people they never noticed before. They question their worth in ways they never admit. Their ego becomes fragile, and every small disappointment feels like a personal crisis. The third wave hits their mind. Anxiety becomes constant. Restlessness becomes daily. Sleep becomes unpredictable. They replay conversations over and over again, searching for ways to regain control they no longer have. Their thoughts become tangled with regrets they refuse to acknowledge and fears they refuse to confront. They are haunted by the realization that the one person who understood them, the one person who cared, the one person who stayed longer than they deserved, has finally stepped into freedom. And instead of admitting their part in the loss, they spiral deeper into denial. The fourth wave hits their plans. Things they once managed easily now fall apart unexpectedly. Projects fail. Opportunities disappear. Promises they made to others cannot be kept. Their impulsive decisions create bigger problems. The confidence that guided their choices is replaced by desperation. They make mistakes they never would have made before. They burn bridges they still need. They sabotage situations out of fear that someone might expose them. And slowly, the world they built begins to work against them, refusing to support the persona they can no longer maintain. The fifth wave hits their spirit. Narcissists may not acknowledge spirituality, but they feel spiritual consequences deeply. They sense when blessings stop flowing. They sense when peace has been removed. They sense when protection has lifted. They sense when favor has faded. They feel a heaviness that cannot be explained through logic or emotion. They feel watched, not by people, but by the weight of their own actions. They feel judged, not by the world, but by the very truth they tried to escape. And this spiritual discomfort grows stronger with each passing day. They try distractions, but distractions stop working. They try new people, but new people lose interest quickly. They try to rebuild their image, but the pieces no longer fit together. They try to regain control, but every attempt backfires. And underneath all of this, something deeper begins to rise within them: regret. Not the kind of regret that leads to repentance, but the kind that leads to obsession. They become obsessed with the freedom you now walk in. They become obsessed with the peace you now carry. They become obsessed with the strength they cannot imitate. They become obsessed with the healing they cannot undo. They become obsessed with understanding how you survived the damage they caused. And the longer they watch your life improve, the more their own life begins to collapse, because your restoration is a reminder of the one truth they fear most. They were never as powerful as they believed. You were not controlled. You were compassionate. You were not weak. You were loyal. You were not blind. You were hopeful. You were not trapped. You were patient. And now that your eyes are open, the narcissist must face a world that exposes their true nature at every turn. Their collapse is not random. It is not accidental. It is not unfair. It is the delayed result of seeds they planted long ago. And the collapse has only reached its middle point. The next stage will bring a reckoning they cannot avoid, a reckoning that reveals just how much they lost the moment you stepped into divine alignment. There comes a moment when a narcissist realizes they can no longer control the story they built around you, and that realization feels to them like the ground beneath their feet is splitting open. This is the moment when the Lord quietly reveals what happens in the unseen realm when a believer finally chooses obedience over confusion, truth over manipulation, and peace over chaos. It begins with something small, almost unnoticeable to anyone but heaven: a shift, a release, a moment where your heart stops responding to the emotional traps that once shaped every step you took. This shift is so quiet that a narcissist never sees it coming. They believe the old patterns will last forever. They believe your compassion will keep bending. They believe your patience will never run dry. But something happens when a believer reaches the place described in James chapter 4 verse 7. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Submission comes first. Resistance comes after. And fleeing is the final result. The narcissist never expected the first step. They never expected God to move your heart into a place where their behavior no longer felt like a storm you needed to solve. They never expected heaven to close your ears to their flattery, their guilt, their false promises, their shifting stories, and their emotional bait. They never expected you to stop explaining yourself, stop defending yourself, stop trying to fix what they never intended to repair. Because when you accepted the will of God, something heavy fell off your shoulders, and something heavy fell onto theirs. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of spiritual balance, out of divine order, out of the reality that God is just. The narcissist begins to feel this shift before they understand it. It shows up in the smallest cracks in their confidence. Their words lose power, their tone loses certainty, their eyes lose the shine of control, their stories lose the ability to bend your emotions. They feel this loss before they can explain it. They feel you slipping through their fingers, even while they pretend nothing has changed. Their greatest fear is not losing you. Their greatest fear is losing the version of themselves they constructed through you. For a narcissist, your role in their life served as a mirror, a place where they saw a reflection of power, admiration, usefulness, importance, and superiority. When you accept the will of God, that mirror shatters. They look at you and see truth. They look at themselves and see emptiness. They look at their future and see consequences. This is the beginning of their prison, and it has nothing to do with metal bars or locked doors. Their prison is spiritual exposure. Their prison is losing the ability to hide behind your forgiveness. Their prison is losing the ability to blame you. Their prison is losing the ability to shape your emotions. Their prison is losing the ability to pull you back with a single message or gesture. Their prison begins with the loss of control, but it deepens into something far heavier: the loss of their audience. A narcissist depends on a constant stream of emotional reactions to feel alive. They need admiration to confirm their identity. They need conflict to feel powerful. They need confusion to maintain control. They need access to your heart to maintain their supply. The moment you accepted God's will, you cut off that supply without drama, without a fight, without a final speech. You simply stepped into peace. And peace is the one environment where a narcissist cannot breathe. This is where the spiritual consequences intensify. Proverbs, chapter 16, verse 18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Destruction does not begin with fire, it begins with loss. Loss of influence, loss of image, loss of superiority, loss of control. The narcissist begins to fall inward long before anyone sees it outwardly. They lose their sense of direction. They lose their inflated self-image. They lose their ability to manipulate the narrative. They lose the audience that once applauded their full strength. They become restless, irritated, suspicious, fearful. Their thoughts start turning against them. Their lies stop sounding believable even to themselves. Their confidence breaks into fragments they try desperately to glue back together. People around them begin to notice the crack. Their charm wears thin. Their excuses sound repetitive. Their stories sound exaggerated. Their mask begins to slip, and the more they try to tighten their grip on control, the faster everything falls apart. This is divine reversal. This is spiritual justice. This is what happens when the Lord steps into the situation and lifts his hand off the person who refused to change. Not because God delights in their downfall, but because God protects the one who finally aligned with his plan. This is why accepting the will of God was not just an act of obedience. It was an act of protection. The moment you stepped into his will, you stepped out of their reach. That decision removed you from their cycle. That decision removed you from their storms. That decision removed you from their spiritual influence. And the narcissist felt the loss immediately. They may pretend to move on. They may pretend to be unbothered. They may pretend to be thriving. But deep inside, they are unraveling. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped participating in their illusion. The illusion they built required your presence. The illusion they lived in required your compassion. The illusion they depended on required your silence. And once you let it go, they had to face the truth they spent years avoiding. Their truth becomes their prison. Their choices become their consequences. Their lies become their loneliness. Their pride becomes their downfall. And while they descend into confusion, you rise into clarity. While they lose everything built on deception, you gain everything rooted in surrender. While they remain trapped in the version of themselves they refuse to let go of, you step into the future God always prepared for you. But this is not the final chapter. Something even deeper happens next, and it is the part of the story the narcissist never expected to face. There comes a moment when a narcissist realizes the silence they mocked is now the silence that exposes them. This is the moment when heaven begins to peel back every layer of deception, every mask they crafted, every excuse they rehearsed, and every lie they relied on. It is the moment when the consequences they once avoided begin to rise like a tide they can no longer outrun. You stepped out of their story, but they are still trapped in the one they wrote. And now, with no one left to blame, no one left to manipulate, and no one left to drain, they begin to face the truth they spent years burying beneath pride. The unraveling begins quietly. It always does. A narcissist does not collapse in public. Their downfall begins in the thoughts they cannot silence. They replay conversations. They question motives. They stalk what they once ignored. They analyze your absence more than they ever valued your presence. This is where the divine shift becomes undeniable. The moment you accepted the will of God, the spiritual ground they stood on began to sink, not because God chose sides, but because God honors truth. And truth is the one thing a narcissist fears. They can handle conflict. They can handle attention. They can handle admiration. But truth strips away their power. Truth forces them into accountability. Truth reveals the gap between who they pretend to be and who they truly are. In Psalm chapter 7 verse 15, Scripture says, "He made a pit and dug it, and has fallen into the ditch which he made." This describes the narcissist perfectly. The trap they set for your heart becomes the trap they fall into spiritually. The chaos they used against you becomes the chaos that surrounds them. The manipulation they sharpened becomes the blade that turns inward. And while they fight their own collapse, something stronger is happening to you. You begin to rise. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. You rise because obedience always lifts. You rise because surrender always strengthens. You rise because truth always heals. You rise because peace always restores. At first, the narcissist senses this rise without knowing how to name it. They feel that you are no longer spiritually accessible. They feel the door is closed. They feel the shift in the atmosphere. Your energy is no longer tied to their actions. Your emotions are no longer shaped by their moods. Your heart is no longer invested in their narrative. This terrifies them. Narcissists fear losing the one who sees their potential more than their behavior. They fear losing the one who forgave them more times than they deserved. They fear losing the one who cared even after being wounded. But that season is gone, and they know it. They try to create new sources of attention. They try to build new narratives. They try to replace what they lost. But replacements cannot mimic spiritual connection. Imitations cannot recreate divine timing. Substitutes cannot fill the void left when God removes someone's influence. What they lost was not just you. What they lost was access to grace. Grace flowing through your patience, grace flowing through your compassion, grace flowing through your forgiveness, grace flowing through your presence. When God removes that grace from their reach, the narcissist enters a new phase of consequences: isolation, confusion, restlessness, suspicion, self-doubt. They begin questioning their identity because their identity was never rooted in truth. Their worth was performance, their confidence was image, their strength was manipulation. Their relationships were tools, not bonds. Without control, they feel hollow. Without admiration, they feel invisible. Without chaos, they feel powerless. Without you, they feel exposed. This exposure is not punishment, it is revelation. God allows the narcissist to see themselves clearly, not to destroy them, but to confront them with the opportunity to change. But change requires humility. And Proverbs chapter 29 verse 23 says, "A man's pride shall bring him low." A narcissist fights humility like a drowning person fights water. They resist surrender, they resist responsibility, they resist correction, they resist truth. They resist anything that threatens the false image they built. And yet, the consequences tighten around them, not because God delights in justice, but because God protects the humble. The consequences are meant to lead them to repentance, but pride pushes them deeper into denial. And while they descend, something powerful happens to your spirit. The clarity you longed for begins to unfold. The peace you prayed for begins to settle. The strength you lost begins to return. The joy you forgot begins to rise. The purpose you postponed begins to awaken. You begin to see why God allowed certain doors to close. You begin to understand why the Lord separated you when He did. You begin to recognize that the pain you walked through was preparation, not punishment. When you accepted God's will, you aligned yourself with the path that leads to restoration. The more you walk forward, the more the past loses its grip. The more you choose peace, the more chaos loses permission. The more you embrace healing, the more brokenness loses influence. The more you choose truth, the more lies dissolve. The narcissist watches this from a distance, confused by a transformation they cannot control, shape, or interrupt. They see your glow returning. They see your stability growing. They see your faith strengthening. They see your life gaining momentum in ways that no longer include them. This is the part they never imagined. They expected you to collapse without them. They expected you to question yourself. They expected you to chase their approval. They expected you to remain stuck. But God had other plans, and those plans unfold in a way no narcissist can predict. The more they lose control, the more you gain clarity. The more they spiral, the more you rise. The more they cling to pride, the more you step into purpose. The more they resist truth, the more truth sets you free. And yet, something deeper is still coming, something the narcissist never prepared for, something that transforms their confusion into fear and your healing into destiny. The next chapter reveals it. There comes a moment when a narcissist realizes the final outcome they feared the most has already happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the exact way the Lord moves when He is finishing a chapter that no longer serves your future. This final moment is not about revenge, punishment, or payback. It is about release. It is about freedom. It is about God taking the last chain they've wrapped around your spirit and snapping it so completely that nothing from your past can follow you into your next season. The narcissist never believed this moment would arrive. They always assumed they could walk back into your life with a new apology, a softened tone, a curated excuse, or a sudden wave of false reflection. They assumed you would hesitate. They assumed you would reconsider. They assumed you would still be standing where they left you. But the one who accepts the will of God is never found in the same place. This final shift begins when your heart recognizes that what once felt like attachment now feels like distance. What once felt like longing now feels like clarity. What once felt like a wound now feels like a lesson. What once felt like confusion now feels like direction. This is the moment described in Isaiah chapter 43 verse 18. Remember not the former things, neither consider the things of old. The past loses its power, the memories lose their sting. The hope you once held for their change is replaced by the peace of your own transformation. The narcissist senses this immediately. They sense that your spirit is no longer accessible. They sense that your compassion no longer bends. They sense that your heart no longer leans toward them. They sense that the spiritual cord tying you to their chaos has been severed. And with this realization comes fear. Not fear of you leaving, fear of what your freedom exposes. Your healing reveals their brokenness. Your strength reveals their weakness. Your clarity reveals their confusion. Your progress reveals their stagnation. Your peace reveals their unrest. Your obedience reveals their rebellion. This spiritual contrast becomes their silent prison. They watch you step into a season they cannot enter, not because God is cruel, but because they refused every opportunity to grow, soften, surrender, and change. Meanwhile, every step you take now feels lighter. Every thought becomes clearer. Every prayer becomes stronger. Every morning carries a new sense of purpose. Every night carries a deeper sense of rest. You are no longer fighting battles that were never yours. You are no longer trying to save someone who never intended to be transformed. You are no longer pouring into a heart that only wanted control. You are no longer negotiating with confusion. You are no longer tolerating cycles. You are simply walking in the direction the Lord prepared long before you ever understood the assignment. And in this final chapter, something sacred happens. You no longer look back with resentment. You no longer look back with longing. You no longer look back with what if. You look back with understanding. You look back with wisdom. You look back with gratitude for the freedom you now carry. Because the greatest victory was not the narcissist losing control. The greatest victory was you regaining your soul. Your peace is restored. Your identity is secure. Your path is aligned with heaven. Your future is protected. Your heart is no longer surrounded by darkness, but wrapped in divine clarity. And now at the end of this message, there is only one truth left to speak. Their prison was losing you. Your freedom was accepting God's will. And the story that once brought you pain will never have that power again. This chapter closes gently, firmly, completely, and your new season begins in silence, strength, and supernatural rest.